Good evening, fellow students. In light of the upcoming mock exams, I'd like to welcome you to analyze another one of John Ernest Greene's famous pieces, this time the short story Whips. Now, I know that none of John Ernest Greene's texts are in the actual anthology, which is a real shame, because they're really fun to analyze and there's a lot to analyze in them. In fact, the examiners would save paper by printing only one page for every exam. Anyhow, I'd like to encourage you to stay with me and analyze this text with me nevertheless, because you can learn a lot about how to analyze a piece and also how to write short stories from this short text. I'm always in awe at just how much meaning John Ernest Greene can hide behind so few words. Anyhow, just like the last video, I would like to encourage you to look at some context before starting. All of these websites are in the description, so please check them out. This is very important for understanding the text fully. So first of all, planet Earth. This is presumably where our story takes place. We don't actually know, it doesn't say, but it's implied. It's also implied that John Ernest Greene was born here. Of course, we don't really know whether he was born at all. All we know is he exists, and he watches over us forever. Next up, human history. Because, just like in the last video, our characters are presumably humans, so it's important to know how exactly our history existed. And I encourage you to take a full history course and study history before starting to analyze this extract. It will really come in handy when you're reading it. Next up, the outline of life forms on planet Earth. You know, the typical stuff, human. Make sure to read all this very carefully, and anything that you don't understand, remember to just check it. There's probably going to be a link to another Wikipedia webpage. Next, John as the given name. In this story, none of our characters have names. We don't even know if we have characters, but we know that John Ernest Greene's name is John. So it's important to know the origins of this word. Johann ben Zakkai, very important. And then slavery. Of course, everything in this text is implied, as I said many times before already. But slavery, it's even more implied than all the other ideas, because this text was actually published in the 18th century, when slavery was still very ripe, and it was only just beginning to fall. So make sure to read up on the history of slavery, and also, since our text is about whips, I also encourage you to find out exactly how whips work, how they look, their history, and also, just as a student tip, I encourage you to open up eBay and search for whips, especially during class. If your teacher spots you looking at whips, you can just tell her you're studying for the exam, and it's almost guaranteed she's gonna give you a high level for that, because, well, not many people study this in depth for an English language exam. So absolutely look through these, probably during class. Next, the COVID-19 pandemic. As we know, it's happening right now, and it's important that you know about it for the context of this piece. And of course, the English language, because that's what our story is written in, so it's important that you familiarize yourself with it, and with how it came to be. And finally, if you can't speak English, I recommend you look for an online English tutor, especially in these times when you can't meet up personally. Preply.com. This episode was actually sponsored by Preply.com. Just kidding, I'm not famous enough for that. Anyhow, you can see all of these excellent tutors who can Skype you at any time and teach you how to speak English professionally. Okay, so now with that out of the way, you can actually start analyzing this text. So, Whips. Short story by John Ernest Greene. So just from the title here, we can actually infer a lot of information. So first of all, if we just look at the sounds that the word whip
creates, or whips rather. So first we have the whip, which is like the long curly part that's like the anticipation until the final explosive. The P is a plosive, which creates this effect of like a bomb or just a whip hitting its target, and it's like a very violent way to start the piece before even actually starting it. And finally we have this that can be interpreted as, in many ways actually, it could be interpreted as like the sound of pain, or it could be the sound of silence that comes after the whip, or it could be interpreted as like a snake thinks, like the person handling the whip could be seen as a snake. And of course it's in a plural form, which makes us see that this isn't just one single case, it's many cases. It multiplies the bloodshed and violence of the whips. And we can also see that the whips aren't actually wielded by characters, so to say. They're acting on their own. So it kind of compares the people who are actually handling the whips to just like machines, or like being slaves in themselves to the whips, succumbing to seeing the bloodshed and violence. So just before we actually start analyzing this piece, I encourage you to get your own physical copy of this text, and then annotate as we go along. The physical copies of this text actually right now go on for as cheap as only $5,000 if you're lucky enough to get them in stock. So it's really a low price to pay for such a magnificent text. I have the digital edition here, the 5th digital edition to be precise, which was revised 4 times in 2015, 2016, 2017 and 2019. And right now, people are hard at work at getting a 2021 version ready, probably by early December, hopefully. And I'm actually lucky enough to have a physical edition. In fact, it's the first physical edition to have ever been printed, and the only physical edition to have ever been printed before 2020, sold to me by some Turkish guy on eBay. I'm really glad I made that purchase for only $500,000. I have an original of such a masterpiece. Alright, so now let's actually analyze the actual text. So if we just skim through all these notes for the text, another note on the text, 5th digital edition, that's specific for this, 589th anniversary edition. This text is actually quite old. Note on the text origins, and somewhere down here we should get to the... no, not on the... there it is. Whoops. So I'll first read through the entire text, and then we'll go through it word by word, just like in the last episode. Whips. A whip whipped. So... if, like me, you're struggling to get over this phase of denial, I recommend you take a few days off, just for the emotions to wear over, and then get back. Alright, let's get to analyzing. So first we have the word "a," which is usually seen as kind of a usefulness word rather than a word to analyze. You know, usually you analyze words such as whips or tree or, you know, juxtaposition, words like that. But "a" is usually overlooked. It's just kind of part of our human language that is just kind of ignored. You just read it, you look over it, and you don't think about it like half a second later. But here, actually, John Ernest Greene presents his first juxtaposition, which is that we actually can find a lot of meaning in this word.
which we have just done right now. And this in turn creates a paradox, because if we find meaning in the fact that there's no meaning, it creates a meaning. So see just how much meaning we can find in a simple word such as a. And in addition, the sound of the word a, it kind of sounds like the beginning of a word. In fact, in this text, it's the beginning of the text itself. So it kind of feels cut off by the whip and the whip again. And it's a symbol of the slave, how his life was cut short by white people taking him and forcing him to do slave labor. And yeah, just as I said before, it's kind of a usefulness word, which is the same way people looked at slaves at the time. Actually, they were just part of the machine. They were like machines. They weren't humans. They weren't seen as emotion, they weren't seen as people who could carry emotion. And finally, we can see that the text is impersonal by the fact that it's just a whip. It's not a specific whip, it's just a random one. And it shows us that even more, that people view slaves as without soul. And they just kind of see them as copies, as clones. And another very important thing, which I get asked a lot actually, and John Ernest Greene was asked a lot, is why the text begins on a whip instead of whips whipped. That would create a more evident image of the slaves being like non-existent. But I think it's important that John Ernest Greene showed us the little part of the slave's life that he could have, to show us how it was taken over brutally by the whip. Okay, so next, the word whip. So obviously there's a repetition of the title here, and we can apply most of the same concepts as we did to the title. And also, since it's a repetition and it gets repeated a third time in whipped, we can see that it really likes to take over. It repeats. It's never ending. It's like an endless cycle of pain and torture. Finally, the word whipped. Now, first of all, we have the final d, which can be seen. Actually, I remember that someone said that the d could be a symbol for death. It could be like an acronym for death, and it could also be seen as like the final, the sound of the body slumping dead onto the floor, or it could be seen as a dramatic ending, like a whipped, like that. Now there's silence and nothing's happening. It's a really powerful way to end the text. And you can also see that whipped is in the past tense, which implies that slavery is something that should be kept in the past and something that shouldn't be repeated anymore. And I think this particular ed at the end is what actually caused slavery to end. Many people think that it's Martin Luther King's speech about his dream, and sure, that all of that was very important in the creation, but actually, if not for this text, I think we would still have slavery and very harsh racism even today. And now, of course, we can see that it's 3/4 or 2/3, depending how you view it, of the text is taken over by the word whip. So you can see that it's repeating, and just like with the repetition, you can see that it's like an endless cycle, and that it constantly consumes the head of everyone. And it's just so sad to see. Alright. And now there's multiple different interpretations we could take over for this text. Firstly, of course, the interpretation of slavery, which is the most obvious one. But if you really want to get a grade 9 in your essay, you will need to look further. You'll need to look at other possible interpretations. People torturing animals is also very obvious. Especially when they whipped horses or bulls to basically the same as slavery. We can also view this as
death, as a metaphor for death, and how death whips us, like life whips us into constantly doing things for our survival, and then death comes at the very end, like we could see with this letter D at the very end, and just robs everything of us, makes everything before that seem completely unimportant. Of course, this could also be a very obvious symbol for capitalism, and how just like death and life, it constantly whips us into doing more and more, and then we just die, and that's it. And all of our money that we have saved up kind of ends. And this could also be seen as by a symbol for a cyclic kind of life, that the whipped, and then we come back to the and we are reborn, and then the whips again. And it's just a very tragic image of life, and that's why I think this text is just so powerful. Thank you, fellow students, for watching this analysis with me. I hope to hear some of your interpretations of the text in the comments. Hopefully you can find more than I have. Goodbye.